You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 10th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
World leaders kick off discussions at NATO's 75th anniversary summit. Australia appoints an antisemitism envoy. Governments struggle with increasing cyber attacks. And with democracy's biggest year ever producing so many of them, what should the next chapter be for ex-politicians? I'm Vincent McAviney. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. My guests Latika Burke and Michael Peel will discuss the day's big stories. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I am Vincent McAviney. Thank you for tuning in. I'm joined today by Latika Burke, journalist for The Nightly and expert on geopolitics, and by Michael Peel, science editor at the Financial Times. Welcome to you both. Latika, you were at a slightly important party last night.
I don't know about important, but champagne-fueled, we should say. The Spectator's annual summer party. It's always the invite everybody wants in Westminster, because usually the cabinet turns out and you've got all the heavy hitters. Mm-hmm. Last night, not so many cabinet ministers because, of course, the Specky is a right-leaning organisation outlet. But we did have a few Labor front benches, a few of the surprises who fell as well on election night, and lots of Tories, including former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Nigel Farage was there.
Oh, I was going to ask you about some of the runners and riders for leadership, because they're out sort of touting themselves about.
Absolutely there.
What was Liz Truss like?
Alone, a lot, interestingly. It's always fascinating to watch party dynamics and see who wants to swill champagne with each other when they're no longer powerful.
And this is a woman who 2 years ago was the toast of the Tory party, fizz with Liz. She was becoming Prime Minister and now just
fizzled out,
no longer an MP on her own in the corner of the party being awkward.
I mean, there were some people around, but it was very notable that I think if Rishi had have come, I think there would have been a lot more clamour around him than there would have been around her.
Oh, well, good thing she has those lifelong police officers to keep her company.
Indeed.
Sounds like. Michael, what about you? What have you been up to?
Well, late last week I covered the fall of one of the Tory big beasts. Latika was talking about Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth, and 27 years after watching Michael Portillo's fall in 1997, sort of emblematic of that night, so it was a long sort of arc there. And Penny Mordaunt gave a short speech afterwards where she really got to the heart of the kind of struggles of the Conservative Party now, where she said that the party needed to make sure that it learned the lessons, that it had not honoured the trust of voters, and that it needed to not get into a situation where it was talking to a smaller and smaller slice of itself. And that's obviously going to be a big theme going forward.
Someone who, if they had kept their seat, would now be running for the leadership of a party, and also someone in her history who has dabbled in a bit of reality TV. We'll be talking about that in a bit. But we're going to cross first to Simon Marks, a reporter based in Washington, D.C. and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. Simon, the first proper day of NATO's 75th anniversary summit is underway. What's happened so far?
Well, Vincent, it's been, as you know, a bit of a split-screen moment here, because the NATO summit officially kicked off around an hour ago with US President Joe Biden welcoming the more than 30 heads of government to this event, marking the 75th anniversary of NATO's founding. Prior to that, the president had opened the summit, urging fresh support for Ukraine, announcing a new US-backed initiative that is being joined by a group of other NATO members to provide fresh aerial defense systems to the government of President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, and again indicated that he believed that NATO was absolutely at the heart of the West's, as he put it, sacred obligation to come to the aid of countries like Ukraine as it comes under continuing assault from Russia. But even as because the president has been trying to focus on the statesman-like issues that he's going to be digging into with those NATO leaders over the next couple of days, there was fresh domestic political difficulty for him in his efforts to continue with his re-election campaign, coming in the form first of an intervention this morning by former Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi, and then, just as Joe Biden was shaking hands at the start of the NATO summit, by an extraordinary guest essay published in the New York Times by George Clooney, now calling on Joe Biden to step down as the Democrats' nominee, presumed nominee, in November's election.
Well, I want to come back to that guest essay, but just first on the NATO summit. I mean, President Zelensky is there. He already knows that he's not going to be getting NATO membership as he had hoped at this summit. But what would be a good outcome for him? Because we saw those devastating attacks once again, missile attacks from Russia earlier in the week.
Yes, and the White House absolutely quick, of course, along with other NATO members, to condemn those Russian attacks. For Volodymyr Zelensky, and I think also for President Biden, there will be the hope that that once again underscores the unity that the White House likes to point to in the alliance about backing President Zelensky and his forces to the hilt. But one major unresolved issue is the question of whether there will be further relaxation in the willingness of some NATO members to allow Ukraine to use NATO-supplied munitions and weaponry in assaults on the other side of the Russian border. That is a big issue that President Zelensky continues to drive home. He will, of course, welcome the new aerial defense systems that President Biden pledged to provide, the support that is going to give to Ukraine as it continues to make efforts to push back against Russia's military advance. But the fact that NATO membership apparently is not going to be offered during the course of this summit, or a particularly clear path to it, is definitely an issue that President Zelensky, I think, will not be happy about as this summit gets underway.
And turning to those domestic affairs, George Clooney only a few weeks ago hosted a lavish and lucrative Hollywood fundraiser for President Biden. He's now withdrawn his support and those comments as well from Nancy Pelosi. I mean, is it death by 1,000 cuts for his candidacy?
Well, certainly the cuts are continuing to come, and at this very moment, President Biden is making his opening remarks at the NATO summit, which relates to something that George Clooney wrote about in his essay for the New York Times. He says that every time Democrats see Joe Biden, they collectively hold their breath. We turn down the volume whenever we see him, who we respect, walk off Air Force One or walk back to a mic to answer an unscripted question. He says of that fundraiser that he held a few weeks ago in Los Angeles, that the Biden I was with 3 weeks ago was not the Joe Biden of 2010. He wasn't even the Joe Biden of 2020. He was the same man we all witnessed at the debate. And he said, this isn't only my opinion. This is the opinion of every senator and Congress member and governor that I have spoken with in private. Every single one, irrespective of what he or she is saying publicly, knows we are not going to win in November with this president. So that, coupled with Nancy Pelosi's insistence that members of Congress should talk privately but not publicly until the end of this NATO summit, indicates that once this summit is over, things here could move very rapidly for the president.
Simon Marks in Washington, D.C., thank you very much. Now, listening to that check-in was our panel here, Latika and Michael. Latika, I'll come to you first. What do you make of the messaging that's coming out of the NATO meeting so far?
I think it's got some very good pieces of detail for Ukraine, and we're going to see what they're calling this bridge for Ukraine's NATO membership. That's obviously not to the satisfaction of the Ukrainians. They would have liked a clearer path by now to how and when they can join NATO. I think some of the security pacts that are being announced as of the last few hours even, we're getting a time frame, for example, of when we'll see fighter jets in Ukraine, something let's keep in mind that that the Western community said could not be given to Ukraine and now is much, much later, and how many lives could have been saved if they'd been given protection of their air before. But overall, I think the big concern is that it's a bit like a horror show, isn't it? Because a lot of people are basically seeing and watching every single twitch, every single blink from an ageing president to see if he can stand up and speak words and get through the week. And that's really the frame around this whole summit.
Michael, just NATO is obviously 75. It's having to somewhat, though, relaunch and reintroduce itself. We've seen, for instance, this week, Jens Stoltenberg out throwing a pitch at a baseball game. Do you think it's necessary to do this kind of public information campaign again in the face of all that disinformation and dubious claims like NATO provoked Russia into invading Ukraine?
Well, I think the bigger picture from this summit, and which actually draws in the Biden story as well, is that this could be the last summit before Trump is back. And I covered NATO from Brussels during the first Trump term, and that was a foretaste of what will come in even more of an existential threat. He flirted and has flirted with the idea of withdrawing from NATO at various points in his career. He's very hostile to the idea of, as he sees it, European free riders on US defence spending. And that's the thing that NATO leaders and ministers will be terrified of, and that's the thing that they need to prepare for. And in a sense, the public information campaign that you talk about is sort of secondary to that bigger looming potential threat.
And Latika, do you think NATO's done enough in the years since Trump departed to actually get its members? A lot of them have been making progress towards that 2% GDP target. Do you think they've done enough potentially for an incoming President Trump to stick with the alliance, which is, let's not forget, the most successful military alliance the world has ever seen?
Yes, I do. But I also think we might be getting a bit lost in the idea that it's one or the other, that Trump can withdraw the US from NATO. He can do a lot of damage remaining inside NATO. And don't forget, Article 5 comes after it. It is then, and this is obviously the collective defence component, if there is an attack on one, it's considered an attack on all. But then it's up to the members to decide how we're going to respond. There's actually no obligation under Article 5 that everyone is going to react to an attack in the same way.
It's just always assumed.
Altogether. That's right. And so in that scenario, you could easily have an America that says, you're on your own. I mean, we're still in NATO, but we decide we're going to do this and you go off and do that. So I sometimes think we're getting a bit distracted by the either or.
And Michael, Keir Starmer has a lot of problems to fix here in the UK, but he's getting a big launch on the world stage with this NATO meeting and then hosting the European political community next week here. If we were to see a Trump presidency with a weakened leadership in Germany and France now, might he be the new Merkel, the sort of de facto leader of the West, keeping things ticking along?
Yeah, I think just to go back to what Latika said, I mean, it's absolutely right that, day one he comes back, he could just end US assistance in Ukraine, he could change policies in all sorts of ways which will have an immediate impact beyond any kind of formal moves within NATO. As for Starmer, well, he's in at once a sort of powerful but also a tricky position, as you say. I mean, for once the British leader looks more secure than others around Europe, but on the other hand, being able to deal with President Trump is just a very, very difficult thing because, he's unpredictable. He'll go off in all kinds of directions. But actually beneath that, there's a bedrock of things he wants to achieve ideologically, and he's not keen on the idea of helping out the Europeans. And for those purposes, Britain is just as much of a European country as France or Germany or any of the others.
And finally, just quickly on this, I mean, do you think the timing of this could have been better? Because to cut the president's legs from under him at the start of such an important summit seems a bit wrong to have done. They could have waited until, Monday, until this conference was done to do this. And what do you think will happen now? Will we see some kind of transition to Kamala Harris, or do they need to have some kind of open running process?
I mean, it's a situation that is evolving by the day, and people are making up as they go along. The lack of choreography, this sense of things piling on top of each other, is a reflection on that. And the pressure does seem to be absolutely huge. But in the end, this is a different situation from a parliamentary system where a leader can be forced out by his or her own party, or there can be a vote of confidence in Parliament. In the end, Biden is going to have to say, actually, I've concluded that I'm not the person to stand in this election.
Well, turning now to Latika's native Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has appointed Gillian Segal as the first anti-Semitism envoy after Jewish people in the country said they felt increasingly unsafe. Albanese also said he would be appointing an envoy to combat Islamophobia. Latika, a rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia has been noted in nations across the world. How much of a problem has it been in Australia since October 7th?
Huge, absolutely huge, and pretty much from day one. Once October 7 happened, we had very disturbing riots or protests, but we heard some terrible phrases chanted, "Gas the Jews," for example, outside the Sydney Opera House. So that was day one. It has not really abated. We've had lots of protests, and I think Australia has compulsory voting and proportional representation. But I think those same currents that we saw emerge in the election in the UK that allowed independent but basically standing on a campaign on Palestine to oust very, very safe Labor members is certainly a trend that we're also going to see in Australia. I think one of the interesting parts about this is that it's come very late. The Jewish community has been saying in Australia for a long time now, we do not feel safe. We're feeling less and less safe. It also comes against, this is a left-wing government in Australia, and it's started to position itself very much, its base is very torn, as all left-wing bases are on this issue. And the Prime Minister has done a few little things that I think many of the pro-Israeli lobby, for example, feel has really let them down. So it's come very late. I'm very intrigued to see that he's also going to, appoint an Islamophobia envoy, because he's also had just very recently, to put this into context, one of his senators quit the party. She crossed the floor, which is a no-no in Australian Labor politics. You can't do that without being expelled. And she's now sitting as an independent, and she's a female Muslim MP. So it's a very, very toxic situation in Australia, and I think it's not one that by any means is going to be solved by these envoys or anywhere close to being over.
Well, Michael, do you think appointing government envoys or czars like this ever works, or is it more a symbolic gesture?
Well, there is a heavy element of symbolism to it. It's true, but symbols count in life, and one of the most important things you can do to a group of people that's suffering discrimination is to show some solidarity by making appointments of this kind. Of course, it highlights what a terrible situation this has been all round, and how there are so many aspects to this which are just really the Gaza conflict, which are just so horrible, and the rise in anti-Semitism in many, many countries is one of them.
Latika, the Jewish Council of Australia, which has been against Israel's actions in Gaza, claims that Segal is an Israeli lobbyist and her position will create a deeper divide. What do you make of that?
Look, I think it's really interesting. The Australian Labor government has done one thing I think is very clever. And for a few months now, they have been making distinctions in any statements they make on Israel to clearly separate the state of Israel from the Netanyahu government. And so you'll see it in all their messaging that we do not support these actions of the Netanyahu government, which means they don't say we don't support Israel's actions, which is a really, really important distinction. I think it's a very, very clever move from them. The Jewish Council or the Jewish community in Australia is very split.
How big a community is it in Australia?
It's very big, yeah, in Melbourne mainly, and in a city, Sydney. This is where most of the populations are. But they are just like Israel inside Israel. There's a lot of dimension and different thought. Not everyone you can say is 100% behind Bibi and agrees with the tactics deployed by this government. So there is a division within the Jewish community itself in Australia. So it's also important to factor those views in.
And one for you both finally on this. It's interesting that earlier this year, Eurovision became so embroiled in debate over Israel's participation. And we've seen other cultural events sort of getting pulled into it. But there doesn't seem to be any of that around the Olympics so far. Does that surprise you?
It's perhaps a hopeful sign that this will be less poisonous than it was around Eurovision. But I think clearly that one of the things to focus on, apart from the horrible rise in anti-Semitism we've seen is to resolve the conflict that's going on. And as Latika says, the very wide range of opinion in Jewish communities, both inside and outside Israel. And of course, complicated by Prime Minister Netanyahu's own position being investigated for corruption. And, there's obviously a strong sense that if things were to quieten down, then life might become tougher for him to remain Prime Minister. So it really needs an effort to, as an increasing number of countries are calling for, to get a ceasefire as a first step to then restart the peace process, which is desperately needed in that region.
And I think, we've talked a lot about Europe and NATO, but I think Israel has a lot to be concerned about, or particularly Netanyahu has a lot to be concerned about should it be a Trump presidency. Because Trump is very let down by Bibi. He's not a fan of him. And I think...
And he takes it very personally because he moved the embassy to Jerusalem.
He absolutely does, yes. So I think we might see a very tough America on Netanyahu and his government should it be a Trump presidency. So you do think there's a self-interest motivating factor here for Israel to actually start looking at the ceasefire very seriously.
Well, now, let's move on. Last month, National Health Service hospitals in South London were targeted in a sustained cyber attack which caused days of disruption and severely threatened patient safety. Q-Lin, a Russia-based hacking group believed to be Kremlin-backed, asked for $40 million in ransom money. The NHS refused and the group published the sensitive pathology data online. It's the latest in a string of state-sponsored attacks on global health systems, other suspected culprits being China and North Korea. Michael, how damaging are these attacks and why do health systems seem particularly vulnerable?
Well, it's damaging and very concerning that it's led to delays in blood tests, which obviously are really, really important for people to have for all kinds of medical conditions, some of them very, very urgent. And it's part of a wider trend of attacks on healthcare data sources by cyber criminals. And of course, the very thing that makes it so dangerous is the thing that makes it so lucrative if you're seeking ransoms, because this is data that the criminals figure people will potentially be able to be willing to pay large amounts to release out of desperation. And of course, it does put authorities in a very, very difficult position because of course you don't want to pay these criminals money, and it is morally outrageous that they are targeting the most vulnerable people in society with these crimes.
Latika, this kind of attack doesn't just jeopardize patient safety, it also drains resources for treatment away from health systems. Why is the international community not getting tougher on this? Because there are rules on targeting medical facilities in war. Do we need similar ones on cyber warfare?
I don't think we've even begun to grapple with where cyber attacks take us. And I think only in the probably last 48 months we are starting to see actual real people understand what hostile state actors with hacking can do to them. So in Australia, we had a very big case where the main private health insurer was hacked and everybody, including the Prime Minister's health details obtained. Now, they were dumped on the dark web and there was a big effort with the media that the government ran and all the experts in saying, look, just nobody go there. Nobody look. And we're not going to pay this ransom. And nobody actually did. There is no real stories about people's health records based on that data that was dumped on the internet. So I think that's one way that the community, I think it's a very positive way that we've responded. The second thing I think that no one's really factored in is how do you insure these crimes? I mean, if you're getting asked for $8 billion in ransom before you can unlock the front door to your own company and your computer system again, we are in serious territory where those crimes, I would think, would not be insurable.
Is some form of retaliation needed to stop this from going on, or some sort of limiting of access to the internet by countries which are participating in this? Michael?
And this is very difficult to achieve, and it's something that clearly, as Latika said, needs to be considered at a higher policy level than we have at the moment. And there are multiple dimensions to this because, of course, one of the trends in healthcare is to acquire more data, because having more data is helpful. It's helpful for individual patients to look at their overall health records and see patterns, and it's helpful in terms of drug discovery, coming up with new diagnostics to see bulk data and look at genes that might be associated with particular conditions. And another complicating factor is the increased involvement of private companies in healthcare data, and indeed in this British case, that's where the vulnerability was. It was in the private company that was the partner of the National Health Service here. And so, there are more gateways, so more data, more gateways, and much more attention needed to be paid at a policy, an international policy level, to how exactly to deal with this.
And just finally on this, Latika, the new Labour government here in the UK has pledged to raise defence spending, but they're going to do a strategic defence review first before they go from 2.3% of GDP to roughly 2.5%. How much of a priority should cyber be?
Massive. And I think actually the government's missing a trick here by subjecting its security, foreign and defence policy to review. They have had 5 years to examine a lot of these problems, and sure, they are getting into office and they have access to a quality and depth of information through the civil service they were previously denied by being in opposition. But I don't think, given the huge challenges that we are facing, that 100-day reviews for defence spending, for the China audit, for example, I really don't think that's a great strategy.
But is part of the problem that successive governments have had problems with Ministry of Defence, and this is a sort of universal problem, is they're not good at procurement. They're pretty terrible. You get these massive project overspends, and that they've kind of not sorted their own issues out.
Mm-hmm. But Labor's had 14 years to come up with policies. It has a lot of people who were in government before. It has a lot of advice. Just ask Tony Blair. He's always offering it. They could definitely have showed us more of what they intend to do before the election. They didn't deliberately because it was an election strategy. And I do think that was a mistake. And I think it leaves Britain shortchanged at a very pressing time.
Well, finally, we've all year been covering here on Monocle. It's democracy's biggest year. 2024 is set to see more people around the world go to the polls than in any other year. One inevitable consequence is the creation of many more former politicians. Life post-political office used to be a somewhat staid landscape of consultancy and conferences, but increasingly the allure of media careers is strong to rehabilitate public images and experience the adoration of the masses once again, if they ever had it, without the pesky business of actually having to govern. Now, in Italy this week, a new programme in the vein of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple sees a fictionalised Angela Merkel solving murder mysteries. Hillary Clinton has her own podcast and a forthcoming quasi-self-help book, and former Conservative politicians here in the UK are rushing to get booked onto reality TV to emulate the glittering careers of former senior politicians like Ed Balls and Michael Portillo. So, Latika and Michael, it used to be said all political careers end in failure. Should that need updating now to say, and then you get a podcast?
Very well said. I think it matters who the person is. I think it matters the sort of program they're going on. I think it matters how they finished in office. And I think it matters what they want to achieve out of it. And you can have some really different complexions there. And I think there's been some really good contributions from people. And I also think I deal with a lot of people who really hate politicians, in when you talk to them. And I always stick up for politicians a bit. Because,
which is dangerous for democracy.
Yes, yeah. And I don't like seeing rank cynicism, because these people do a good job. They work extremely hard. They don't do it for a lot of money in this country, let's be honest. And yes, they're vain, they want power, they want all those things, and we should rightly scrutinise them and force them to be as transparent. But actually, at the end of the day, they are humans and they're taking on big jobs. And I think sometimes it's nice to show that dimension of them too.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, I mean, arguably, Jacob Rees-Mogg with his persona is already a reality show, I would say. So he will probably make that transition very easily. I think
a lifelong character actor,
very, very, very much so. And I think there's a sort of serious side to this, which is when you get people who, in the case of Britain, were in government or advisors to government, governments which ruled this country for more than a quarter of a century. What you also get, I think, is perhaps potentially a kind of narrowing of political debate, because explicitly or implicitly, apart from giving sincere views on political developments of the day, they'll also be aware of the need to protect their own legacies. And, that can sort of constrain discussion of the roles in which, for example, the last Labour government of the Blair-Brown era or the earlier Conservative governments of Cameron and so on, what role decisions they took are actually playing in events that we see today. So I think there is a sort of darker side to this. And, the other point, a sort of lighter observation, that Angela Merkel as Miss Marple is it's an interesting thought, but I'm not quite sure she has that sort of brilliant thing that when I was growing up, Joan Hickson was playing Miss Marple in the BBC adaptations in the 1980s, and she just captured perfectly the way that Miss Marple operated by portraying herself as this very frail old woman, but of course with this immense brain and knowledge of human nature beneath it, which led, she made a career out of being underestimated. And Angela Merkel, I think, is a sort of outwardly tougher cookie than that. So it'll be interesting to see how
maybe they should try
off.
a spin-off with Theresa May instead. That might work a bit better for them.
Yeah, might have to wait a few more years to get the full Joan Hickson effect.
But this isn't, a sort of absolute path into public adoration, is it? Because it can go wrong. We've had Matthew Hancock here, who was our health secretary in the pandemic, trying to do this, going on an SAS show, going on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and the public did not warm to him. So it's not always Ed Balls doing Strictly Come Dancing and Michael Portillo doing endless doing endless train documentaries. There is a sort of peril to this, isn't there?
Absolutely, and that's why it matters how and why they're doing it. It matters, of course, the timing. I mean, Hancock had only just quit Parliament, hadn't he?
And he was still an MP.
Oh, he was still an MP, yes. You have a ridiculous rule in this country where you can take more than one job when you're an MP, which I think is just an invitation for these sorts of things. No, I do. And going back to the start of our conversation, I mean, you could see somebody like Liz Truss thinking that people still want to hear her opinions. And
it's been very clear that is not the case, given her book sales.
And I think the key here is self-awareness. If the politician has self-awareness about what they're doing, what they want to achieve out of it, what format they do it in, you can get a brilliant moment like Ed Balls and completely reshape.
Doing Gangnam Style on Saturday night. Yeah.
Yes, and also I think there's a bit of fun in politics that's sometimes nice to showcase too. But I'm definitely not up for mass politicians going on reality shows as a blanket rule, Vincent. Don't take me wrong.
Finally, and just briefly, which ex-MPs, ex-politicians would you like to see in which reality shows coming forward? Because I think there are some really good candidates they're going to do a Celebrity Traitors here in the UK. We've already seen John Bercow, the former speaker, do the US version. But which would you like to see maybe in that show or in another show?
Oh, this has put me on the spot. Okay, I'm going to make a confession which I've never told anyone publicly before.
Okay.
I watch Married at First Sight sometimes.
Okay, yeah. Steph, our producer, is clapping her hands in the studio. It's quite big in the Monocle office, I've got to say.
You've only got to watch the Australian version because there's just something so outrageously terrible in the way they all treat each other.
Okay.
I'd probably be up for a politician on maths because I think it would be just so hilarious and mind-boggling.
Okay, well, politics does destroy a lot of marriages, so there are quite a few.
Well, the whole show is political, right?
Around. Yeah,
so it would actually kind of suit the format, I think.
Michael, who would you like to see in the jungle or on the dance floor or in that traitor's mansion?
Gordon Brown, I think.
Wow!
To complete his rehabilitation, he's sort of become more and more a kind of senior, listened to statesman voice, and but still has that sort of sense of awkwardness and shyness, and this could be what he needs to make that transition in full.
I would love to see Michael Gove in the Traitor's Mansion because he is the arch schemer of the last 14 years in British politics, and I think it would be fascinating to see him, trying to play that game.
But isn't that the show where you get knocked out if you are the traitor? I mean, it would be just too obvious.
Yeah,
it?
But I mean, he's just. I think he has such a problem with coming across sincerely that everyone's going to think he's won anyway. So it'd be quite interesting to see how he works it.
Double and triple bluffs.
Indeed. Well, Latika Burke and Michael Peel, thank you so much for joining me today. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series remembers evolution going on trial in Tennessee. Here's Monocle's contributing editor and usual host of this very show, Andrew Muller.
The phrase trial of the century is one of those media cliches which has been overused to the point of meaninglessness. It is applied to more or less any proceedings in which someone you've seen on television finds themselves in the dock.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation.
For example. However, if any one trial does justify the accolade, it is the one which began on July 10th, 1925, in a small American town called Dayton. The state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes can be declared the trial of the century in two senses of the phrase, being momentous in and of itself, and an examination of the progress of human enlightenment. The trial of the century was also, in its way, a trial of the century. John Scopes was a 24-year-old schoolteacher who essentially volunteered to be prosecuted. The law under which he was hauled before the beak was the Butler Act, named for its patron, Tennessee State Representative John Washington Butler. The Butler Act prohibited, on pain of fines, Tennessee state schools from teaching any ideas about evolutionary biology not congruent with the first chapter of the Book of Genesis. The American Civil Liberties Union offered to assist in the defence of any teacher charged under the Butler Act. A local businessman, George Rapelier, helped convince Dayton authorities and John Scopes that such a trial would be an instructive legal precedent, but, doubtless more pertinently, a colossal publicity boon to the first jurisdiction to hold one. Not for the last time in American legal history, a trial became difficult to discern from a circus. Arguably, the preeminent blowhard of his time was drafted to lead the prosecution. This was William Jennings Bryan, 3 times a loser as a Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States, later briefly Secretary of State, a man with a relish for rousing oratory, especially his own. Defending Scopes and defending evolution, probably the most in-demand lawyer of the era, Clarence Darrow, and playing barely fictionalized versions of these adversaries 35 years later in Stanley Kramer's Inherit the Wind, Frederick March and Spencer Tracy.
We must not abandon faith. Faith is the most important thing.
Then why did God plague us with the power to think, Mr. Brady? Why do you deny the one faculty of man that raises him above the other creatures of the earth?
But the best-known chronicling of the Scopes trial remains that composed at the time by the doyen of the media pack, who scrambled to Dayton the second they found it on their maps.
Monkey business down in Tennessee.
H.L. Mencken, for it was he, was the most famous journalist in America. By 1925, he was 45 years old and a household name. The Sage of Baltimore, as he was known, was a prodigious reporter, author, literary critic, and essayist. He was a gleeful, unregenerate misanthrope who goaded, teased, and skewered the sacred cows of simpler folk with the elan of a matador dispatching an uncomprehending bovine. He once described his fellow Americans as
the most timorous, sniveling, poltroonish, ignominious mob of serfs and goose-steppers ever gathered under one flag in Christendom since the end of the Middle Ages.
Certainly, Mencken was the most infamous journalist in the American South. In 1917, he'd written for the New York Evening Mail, a spectacularly unflattering depiction of the former Confederacy. Entitled The Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, Mencken's Jeremiad dismissed the realm beneath the Mason-Dixon line as a gargantuan paradise of the fourth rate, further jeering that it is as if the Civil War stamped out all the bearers of the torch and left only a mob of peasants on the field. His report for the Baltimore Sun of the proceedings of this day 99 years ago went to no lengths to spare Dayton's feelings.
The townspeople are simply unable to imagine a man who rejects the literal authority of the Bible. The most they can conjure up, straining until they are red in the face, is a man who is in error about the meaning of this or that text. Thus, one accused of heresy among them is like one accused of boiling his grandmother to make soap in Maryland.
As Mencken might have predicted, Scopes was duly convicted of teaching evolution and fined $100, though this was subsequently struck down on a technicality. Shunned in Tennessee education circles thereafter, Scopes spent most of his life working in oil. He died in 1970. William Jennings Bryan did not get long to enjoy his triumph. He died suddenly in Dayton a few days after court was dismissed, aged 65. H.L. Mencken clearly enjoyed writing Jennings' Baltimore Sun obituary, however. Listeners can raise their hand the very second it reminds them of something or someone.
Bryan was a vulgar and common man, a cad undiluted. He was ignorant, bigoted, self-seeking, blatant, and dishonest. His career brought him into contact with the first men of his time. He preferred the company of rustic ignoramuses. It was hard to believe, watching him at Dayton, that he had traveled, that he had been received in civilized societies, that he had been a high officer of state. He seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. Imagine a gentleman, and you've imagined everything that he was not. The job before democracy is to get rid of such canaille. If it fails, they will devour it.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
My thanks to Andrew Muller there. And that's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists, Latika Burke and Michael Peel. Today's show was produced by Henry Rees-Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Vincent McAviney here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.